Moscow did not wake up that morning. It flinched. Before sunrise, the sky over Putin's capital was already flashing with fire, smoke, and air defense bursts. Flights stopped. Roads locked up. Families ran to hallways and basements. And for the first time in a way nobody inside the city could ignore, the war was no longer far away. This was not a rumor. It was not a single drone drifting off course. It was a direct shock to the heart of Russia's power, aimed at a city that had spent most of this war believing distance could still protect it. That belief broke in one night, and once it broke, everything else started to look different. By the time the first daylight cut through the smoke, Moscow's own officials were still counting what had just happened. Drone after drone had come toward the capital. Explosions had been reported across the region. A major refinery was burning again. Apartment buildings were damaged. Airports were shut. The question was no longer whether Moscow could be reached. The question was how bad this could get next. And that is why this moment matters so much. Because this was not just about noise in the sky or another overnight strike report. This was about pressure, political pressure, economic pressure, psychological pressure. By the end of this story, you will understand why this one attack felt bigger than the fire itself, and why it may mark a new phase in the war. The night unfolded into the early hours of June 18, 2026. The main target stood on the southeastern side of Moscow, inside the city's own orbit of life and movement. It was the Moscow oil refinery, one of the most important energy sites feeding the capital region, not hidden in some remote industrial belt, not deep in Siberia. Right there, close enough for ordinary people to smell it burn. That detail changes everything. Ukraine had already spent months targeting Russian fuel and energy facilities across the country. Refineries had been hit before, depots had burned before, supply chains had been shaken before, but those strikes often landed far from the Kremlin, far from the neighborhoods where Russia's political elite sleep, travel, and tell the public that control remains firm. This time was different because the target sat inside Moscow's own system. It was tied directly to the fuel needs of the capital and the surrounding region. Reports tied the site to a large share of local gasoline and jet fuel demand. In simple terms, this was not just another refinery, it was one of the main engines helping keep the city moving. And this was not even the first hit. Just 2 nights earlier, the same refinery had already come under attack. The first strike reportedly damaged key processing infrastructure, including a main distillation unit tied to a major share of the plant's capacity. Before repair work could truly stabilize the situation, the second wave arrived. Same site, same pressure point, harder message. That choice matters. When a target gets hit twice in less than a week, the goal is usually bigger than headlines. It suggests a deliberate attempt to stop recovery, overwhelm repair crews, and turn one successful strike into a longer crisis. A damaged facility can be more vulnerable than an untouched one. Temporary fixes sit exposed. Workers rush, systems strain. Mistakes multiply, then the next attack lands. By morning, multiple hotspots were reported across the refinery grounds. Fire rose from separate sections of the complex. Open source trackers and local channels pointed to damage spread across storage areas and key industrial units. The exact full repair picture was still unclear in the immediate aftermath, but the visible result was not. The site was burning again, and the city could see it. For Ukraine, that was part of the message. A strike in a remote region hurts Russia's fuel system. A strike inside Moscow hurts Russia's image. It tells officials, investors, military planners, and everyday residents the same thing at once. No place feels fully sealed anymore. No power center feels entirely beyond reach. No amount of distance from the front line guarantees calm. That psychological effect may be as important as the physical damage itself. Wars are not only fought with territory and ammunition, they are also fought with fear, uncertainty, and the collapse of old assumptions. Moscow had spent years living under the broad idea that whatever happened elsewhere, the capital would remain largely insulated. That night forced millions of people to rethink that comfort. The official numbers added to the shock. Moscow's mayor gave running updates as air defenses engaged drones approaching the capital. By the end of the morning, the tally stood at 194 drones intercepted on the approaches to Moscow. That number, repeated across wide coverage of the event, made this the largest confirmed drone attack on the Russian capital since the full-scale invasion began. That alone would have made the night historic, but the wider national picture looked even bigger. Russia's defense ministry claimed that 555 drones had been downed across the country over the same broader period. That national figure is harder to verify independently in full, and military claims in wartime should always be treated with caution. Still, even allowing for uncertainty, the scale was impossible to ignore. What mattered inside Moscow was not the countrywide total. It was what people heard and felt outside their own windows. Sirens, bursts in the sky, delays in official messaging, airport closures, smoke over the southeastern districts, confusion spreading through local chat groups, questions piling up faster than answers. When a city that size loses its sense of routine, panic does not need permission to spread. The human toll in the first hours was difficult to pin down with one neat number. Different Russian officials released different counts. Some cited 16 injured across the broader regional impact. Others referred to at least 17, including children in the Moscow region. Prosecutors confirmed residential damage and casualties without locking the public record into a single fixed total in those first reports. That kind of mismatch is normal after a chaotic event. Hospitals report at different times. Regional officials speak before final verification. Emergency crews move faster than paperwork. The real point is not whether the final early count leaned closer to 16 or 17. The point is that multiple official sources confirmed injuries, damaged housing, and a real civilian impact that could not be dismissed as rumor. Residential buildings in and around the Moscow area were struck or damaged during the attack. Open source analysts geolocated footage from at least one multi-story building, with visible impact damage to upper floors. In another town southeast of the capital, officials confirmed a drone had hit an apartment building. Elsewhere, falling debris was reported near commercial structures. These were not just military map points. People lived there. That does not automatically mean civilian housing was the intended target. Throughout this war, both direct strikes and falling debris from interceptions have caused damage beyond the original target path. Air defense success does not always mean a clean outcome on the ground. Intercepted drones still fall. Shrapnel still lands. Fires still spread. For people below, the distinction can feel painfully thin in the moment. One detail from local reporting captured the reality better than statistics ever could. A resident living near the affected area described the smell from the burning refinery as so strong that even with the windows shut, breathing inside the apartment was still hard. That is the kind of sentence that cuts through abstraction. Not strategy, not geopolitics, just smoke inside a home in Moscow. And once that happens, the war becomes personal in a new way. A refinery fire on a map is one thing, smoke in your bedroom is another. So is the sound of repeated air defense fire above the city. So is the message from your airline telling you not to come to the airport. So is the sight of your capital suddenly behaving like a place under direct threat. The airports may have been the clearest sign to the outside world that this was more than a localized strike. All 4 of Moscow's airports were forced to suspend arrivals and departures during the attack. At some points, operations briefly resumed, only to halt again as more drones approached. The city's air network did not simply slow down. It froze, restarted, and froze again. That kind of stop and start matters because it shows how unstable the threat picture was. This was not one explosion followed by cleanup. It was a moving wave of danger that forced repeated decisions in real time. Airport staff had to judge risk moment by moment. Travelers were left stranded. Flights were canceled. Terminals became holding zones. Routine collapsed into reactive crisis management. At one of Moscow's biggest airports, dozens of departures scheduled through the early morning hours were canceled outright. Staff reportedly moved people away from aircraft and into safer areas, including underground spaces used as improvised shelter. Airlines warned passengers to stay away unless absolutely necessary and to handle refunds or rebooking remotely. That alone tells you how seriously the threat was being treated. When a major capital city tells its own people not to come to the airport, the signal is bigger than transportation. It sends a message about control, about confidence, about normal life. Airports are symbols of movement, connection, and state functioning. Once they start shutting down under drone pressure, viewers across the world no longer see a distant front. They see disruption hitting Russia's core. Then came the images that carried even more political weight. Security around the Kremlin was visibly tightened. Red Square was reportedly sealed off. Heavy security appeared around the center of state symbolism. Even if the direct military threat to the Kremlin itself remained unclear, the symbolism was brutal. The Russian state had to visibly defend the center of its own image from a war it launched elsewhere. That matters because symbolism has followed this conflict from the start. The Kremlin is not just a building complex, it is a theater of power. Every parade, speech, and carefully staged message depends on the idea of strength, stability, and distance from chaos. Once visible security hardens around it after a mass drone attack, even for caution alone, the image of invulnerability starts to crack. And this was not the first time Moscow had faced that kind of symbolic pressure. Back in 2023, Russian officials accused Ukraine of trying to strike the Kremlin with drones in what Moscow called an assassination attempt against Putin. Ukraine denied that claim, and the event was never fully verified by outside investigators. But the political memory of drones near the Kremlin never disappeared. So when Red Square closes and extra security appears after a much larger attack years later, the meaning is immediate. Even if the actual target is a refinery miles away, the state knows how this looks. It looks like danger approaching the center. It looks like a capital on alert. It looks like a message that no official statement can completely contain. Ukraine did not stay silent about its role either. That was striking in itself. Kyiv has often been cautious in how openly it confirms strikes deep inside Russia. But here, Ukrainian officials framed the attack as a justified response to Russian assaults on Ukrainian cities and a direct blow against facilities sustaining Russia's war machine. The signal was clear. This was not an accident. It was an answer. That answer carried several layers at once. At the military level, it targeted fuel and processing capacity tied to Russia's broader war effort. At the political level, it embarrassed Moscow by forcing a public crisis in the capital. At the psychological level, it aimed to make ordinary Russians feel some of the instability that Ukrainians have lived with for years. That combination is what made the strike so sharp. One of the most revealing aspects of the aftermath was how openly Ukrainian officials leaned into the moment online. Instead of letting confusion spread on its own, they pushed a narrative. If Russians were asking why Moscow was now under attack, the answer from Kiev was blunt. Russia started the war. Russia kept it going. If the capital now felt exposed, blame the man in the Kremlin. That is information warfare in its purest modern form. Not just missiles and drones, but interpretation. Not just damage, but framing. The physical strike hurts infrastructure. The public message tries to redirect fear into political meaning. Ukraine was not only trying to burn fuel, it was trying to shape how the event would be understood inside Russia, across Europe, and among allies watching closely. Timing may have helped that effort. The attack came as NATO defense ministers were gathering in Brussels, with Ukraine still high on the agenda. A dramatic strike on Moscow itself, especially one hitting a major fuel site twice in 1 week, guaranteed attention. It reminded Western capitals that Ukraine still had reach, initiative, and the capacity to impose pressure deep inside Russian territory. That matters in a long war where support is always political as well as military. Governments do not just ask who is suffering, they ask who is adapting, who can still act, who can still change the battlefield, or in this case, the strategic depth behind it. A strike like this sends a message to allies that Ukraine remains dangerous, creative, and capable of forcing Russia to spend resources on defense. And Russia does have to spend those resources. Every drone wave aimed at Moscow forces a costly response. Air defenses fire, airports shut, security tightens, repair crews mobilize, emergency services spread out, industrial damage triggers more repairs, more inspections, more disrupted schedules. Even when the state claims successful interceptions, the defensive burden keeps growing. That burden is part of the strategy, too. This is where the refinery campaign becomes so important. Over the past year and more, Ukraine has steadily aimed at Russian energy infrastructure. Independent tracking has pointed to a large share of Russia's major refineries being struck at some point in that campaign. And the reason is straightforward. Fuel matters to the military. Fuel matters to transport. Fuel matters to industry. Fuel also matters to public calm. If long front lines harden into slow attrition, then rear infrastructure becomes the softer nerve. You may not break an army in one night by hitting a refinery, but you can raise costs, complicate logistics, and create repeated pressure points that spread far beyond the blast zone. The war stops feeling contained. Shortages become thinkable. Delays become normal. Anxiety becomes part of ordinary life. The Moscow refinery at the center of this attack was especially important because of what it serves. Reports described it as supplying a major portion of the capital region's fuel, including gasoline and jet fuel. That makes it more than a war target. It becomes a target tied to civilian mobility, airport operations, road traffic, delivery systems, and the everyday machinery of one of Europe's largest cities. And once you understand that, the double strike makes even more sense. A hit on a refinery in a distant region hurts output. A hit on a refinery inside Moscow's orbit hurts output and perception at once. It tells people with money, influence, and proximity to power that the economic war is moving closer. It tells them the center may have to absorb more pain than before. The deeper question is whether this kind of pressure can change behavior. That is always the hardest part to answer. Fear alone does not automatically lead to political action. In tightly controlled systems, fear can also produce silence, adaptation, or displaced anger. People may complain about airport delays, fuel disruptions, and smoke in the air without ever openly blaming the leadership that created the war itself. That pattern has shown up before. Russia has already faced disruptions tied to the war that hit daily life in visible ways. Flights have been delayed, fuel systems have come under strain, border regions have seen repeated attacks, yet frustration often stays scattered. It becomes irritation, not organized pressure. It becomes private grumbling, not public challenge. The state counts on that gap between suffering and accountability. Still, Moscow is different, not because its residents are braver or more political by nature, but because the city occupies a special place in the Russian imagination. It is the seat of national power, elite life, strategic planning, and public spectacle. When disruption reaches Moscow, it carries more symbolic weight than when the same thing happens in a distant region many viewers barely follow. That is why the airport closures mattered so much. It was why the refinery fire mattered so much. It was why the visible security around the Kremlin mattered so much. These images hit the central narrative of the Russian state. They challenge the idea that the war can be managed on the edges forever, while the capital continues life under a shield of distance and prestige. To see the full meaning, you have to place this night inside a larger pattern. Moscow had already experienced serious disruptions earlier in the year. In one earlier episode, hundreds of flights were delayed around the city after a surge in drone activity and the collapse of a brief ceasefire. Passengers slept in terminals. Delays stretched for hours. The city had already been tested before this. But those earlier moments now look like warning shots. What happened in June was bigger, sharper, and more concentrated. The number of drones approaching the capital jumped to a new level. The damage reached a major energy site again. Civilian structures were affected. Airport systems had to repeatedly suspend operations. The rhythm had changed. This no longer looked like rare harassment. It looked like sustained pressure. Later attacks and continuing drone activity around Moscow only strengthened that impression. Reports in the period around the strike suggested that Russian air defenses had been facing repeated pressure over successive days, with large interception counts still being announced. Whether every official number was precise or not, the operational truth remained visible. Moscow's defenses were not responding to one isolated surprise. They were being worked hard. That is an important difference. A one-off strike can be framed as an exception. A pattern is harder to hide. Once attacks come often enough, the public begins to build them into expectations. The question changes from, did this happen, to how often will it happen again? And once a population starts living inside that second question, the psychological landscape shifts in a deeper way. For Ukraine, that shift may be one of the main goals. No one expects drones alone to decide the war, but they can force Russia to defend more territory, spread more resources, and confront more internal disruption. They can also help compensate for the brutal difficulty of major land offensives. If territorial breakthroughs remain rare and costly, deep strikes become one way to keep initiative alive. They also speak directly to justice in the eyes of many Ukrainians. For years, Ukrainian cities have faced repeated Russian missile and drone attacks. Civilians have lived through nights of sirens, blackouts, shattered windows, burning fuel depots, and damaged housing. Against that background, a strike that makes Moscow feel even a fraction of that instability carries emotional force far beyond the physical damage itself. That force is not just revenge, it is narrative reversal. It challenges the old one-way flow of fear. It says the side under bombardment can also reach back. It says geography is no longer enough. It says the capital of the aggressor state cannot remain emotionally detached from the war forever. That matters in war because moral perception and psychological momentum are never separate from strategy. At the same time, there are limits. Moscow still does not live under the daily intensity that many Ukrainian cities have endured since 2022. That comparison must remain clear. A single night of mass disruption in the Russian capital, even a historic one, does not equal years of sustained bombardment on the other side. The scale, frequency, and human burden remain profoundly unequal, but that very contrast is part of why this attack landed so hard. Moscow has been relatively protected compared with places like Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, and countless frontline communities. When even a temporary taste of disruption reaches the Russian capital, it feels extraordinary precisely because normal life there had stayed far more stable than normal life in war-hit Ukraine. The shock comes from the broken expectation. There is another strategic layer here, and it may be one of the most important. Refineries are not easy to replace quickly. Even if a strike does not destroy a facility outright, it can damage specialized units, create fire risk, interrupt throughput, and delay restoration for weeks or months. Complex industrial systems do not bounce back overnight, especially when attacks threaten to return before repairs finish. That is why repeat strikes can be so effective. The first hit imposes damage. The second hit punishes recovery. The third, if it comes, can turn short-term disruption into long-term drag. Russia can repair. Russia can reroute. Russia can cover shortages with reserves or logistics shifts. But every extra layer of strain costs money, time, planning, and political confidence. None of that is free. The refinery in Moscow mattered even more because it was tied to jet fuel. Once airports start closing under drone pressure and the regional fuel system also comes under strain, the image becomes even more powerful. It is not only that drones are hitting the city. It is that the systems that keep the city airborne and moving are under stress from two directions at once. That kind of layered pressure makes modern warfare feel less like a front line and more like a web. Hit logistics, and civilian movement suffers. Hit fuel, and military readiness feels indirect strain. Hit airports, and global attention follows instantly. Hit a symbolic capital, and political meaning spreads faster than smoke. Each strike becomes more than its own blast. It becomes part of a network effect. What about Russia's air defenses? On paper, the interception numbers were meant to show strength. Hundreds of drones downed, the capital protected, the system functioning. But there is another way to read the same figures. If that many drones had to be intercepted on the approaches to Moscow, then that many drones got close enough to demand response. That is not a calm picture. It is a warning one. An interception is not the same as immunity. Air defense success reduces damage. It does not erase the costs of activation, debris, panic, closures, and uncertainty. It also does not guarantee that every defended target remains safe. Even a small number of penetrations can matter if the target is valuable enough. One refinery burn, one runway shutdown, one apartment hit, one security lockdown. That is enough. This is why words like panic begin to appear so quickly after events like this. Panic does not always mean chaos in the streets. Sometimes it means a city losing confidence in its own routines. It means residents checking messaging apps instead of sleeping. It means airport staff running shelter procedures before dawn. It means people smelling industrial fire and wondering whether this will happen again tomorrow night. And tomorrow night is always the real question. Not just what happened, but whether this is now the beginning of something more regular. Once the largest confirmed drone attack on Moscow has happened, the barrier of imagination is gone. Residents, officials, and planners all know that the threshold can be crossed. From then on, every alert carries the memory of the night it already happened. That memory can change behavior slowly, almost invisibly. People travel differently. Businesses review contingency plans. Security forces stay more active. Political leaders think harder about what can be defended and what cannot. Energy sites may increase protection, but protection costs resources. Airports may refine emergency procedures, but refined procedures still mean repeated disruption when threats return. The attack leaves behind a long administrative shadow. For Putin, that shadow is dangerous because it touches the central promise of his rule: stability, control, distance from chaos. Even many Russians who disliked corruption or resented hardship could live with the system as long as the state seemed solid and the center seemed protected. Drone swarms over Moscow strike directly at that image. They do not destroy it in one blow, but they chip it. And once the image starts to chip, every future disruption works harder. Another closure, another fire, another emergency shelter, another statement from the mayor in the middle of the night. Each one adds to a growing pattern that even loyal state messaging may struggle to make feel ordinary. People can be told the situation is under control only so many times before they start measuring control by their own sleep. That does not mean political collapse is around the corner. It means pressure is accumulating. Wars often move like that, not through one dramatic turning point, but through repeated erosion. One side keeps forcing costs. The other side keeps absorbing them. Over time, the question becomes whether the burden remains manageable or begins to affect real choices about strategy, resources, and political risk. The domestic response inside Russia will be worth watching closely. Will people mostly adapt, as they have before, treating the attack as another difficult but temporary event? Or will repeated strikes on the capital region begin to change conversations in subtler ways? Not open rebellion, not instant public challenge, but shifts in mood, harder questions in private, growing fatigue with a war once kept at emotional distance. Ukraine clearly hopes for that second outcome. Its public messaging after the attack showed as much, but hope is not certainty. Russian society has shown a strong ability to absorb, normalize, and compartmentalize pressure during this war. Fear does not always become blame. Sometimes it becomes routine. The struggle then is to make routine itself feel expensive enough that it starts shaping choices at the top. From a military point of view, the bigger question is whether Ukraine will keep focusing on repeat attacks against a smaller set of very high-value targets. That strategy could prove more disruptive than scattering strikes widely for headline effect. If a few key facilities matter more than many secondary ones, then sustained pressure on those nodes may create outsized economic and political stress over time. The Moscow refinery fits that model almost perfectly. It is economically important. It is geographically symbolic. It is close enough to population centers that the consequences are visible. It is tied to daily life, and now it carries a public memory of vulnerability. Hitting it once created shock. Hitting it twice created a pattern. If it is hit again, that pattern turns into a strategic narrative. That narrative would be hard for Moscow to bury. Each repeat strike would ask the same ugly question in a louder voice. If the state knows this site matters so much, why can it not fully protect it? And if it cannot fully protect this, what else can it not fully protect? Those questions spread beyond one refinery. They travel into public trust itself. There's also the message being sent to other Russian cities. If a refinery inside the orbit of the capital can be hit twice in 1 week, then energy infrastructure near other major urban centers may also look increasingly exposed. That would widen the psychological field of the war inside Russia. Instead of remote damage in distant industrial zones, more civilians would begin thinking about local consequences. That is a serious escalation in perception, even if not yet in destruction. People react differently when the map of risk moves closer to home. A damaged facility in a far region can feel like news. A damaged facility near your city feels like a threat. Once enough people start making that shift, governments face a different kind of pressure. Not only military pressure, but civilian expectation pressure. And expectation pressure can become surprisingly powerful in authoritarian systems, not because citizens suddenly vote leaders out, but because the state depends heavily on projecting competence. It must appear ahead of events, not drag behind them. Every emergency closure, visible fire, and security scramble chips at that projection. The more public the disruption, the harder it becomes to preserve the image of complete command. Still, the state will try. It will emphasize interceptions. It will underline resilience. It will frame attacks as proof of enemy desperation. It will highlight recovery and continuity. That is predictable. What matters more is the gap between that message and lived experience. If people see airports close, smell refinery smoke, and watch local buildings damaged, official confidence starts competing with their own senses. That competition between narrative and experience may define the next stage of these deep strikes. Not whether every target is destroyed, but whether the capital's residents begin to internalize a different understanding of the war. Once the war feels close, expensive, and recurring, even private loyalty starts to thin. And private thinning over time is how political weather begins to change. For the broader war, this attack also says something about adaptation. Russia improved defenses. Ukraine adapted around them. Russia hardened key areas. Ukraine found ways to keep pressure on them. That back and forth is the real engine of long conflicts. No tactic stays dominant forever. No shield stays absolute forever. Each side keeps probing for the next weak seam in the other's system. Right now, deep strikes on fuel and infrastructure look like one of Ukraine's most consequential seams to exploit. They do not require territorial occupation. They do not demand the same manpower as a major offensive. They produce visible effects. And they speak to multiple audiences at once: citizens, soldiers, allies, adversaries, markets, media. Very few actions in war can do all of that at once. That is why this one night in Moscow mattered so much more than a single damage report. It was a stress test on the idea of distance. It was a stress test on the idea of central safety. It was a stress test on Russia's ability to keep the war emotionally far from its own capital. And for several long hours before sunrise, that test looked brutal. The fires, the airport suspensions, the damaged buildings, the injury reports, the security response, the online panic, the visible smoke over the city, all of it added up to one unmistakable truth. Moscow had been forced to feel the war, not as a headline from elsewhere, but as a direct interruption to its own life. That is what made the strike historic. And that is also what makes the aftermath so important. The blast itself ends. The smoke thins. Flights resume. Officials issue statements. Repair crews start work. But the strategic result keeps unfolding after the flames die down. Did the refinery lose major sustained capacity? How quickly can systems recover? Will strikes return before full repairs are complete? Will residents treat this as a shock or a new normal? Those are the questions that matter now. Because the story is not just about what was hit. It is about what has changed. In the old version of this war, Moscow watched. In this version, Moscow braces. That is a profound difference. It does not mean the capital is collapsing. It means the capital is participating now, whether it wanted to or not. And that may be the real meaning of the biggest raid on Moscow. Not that one night destroyed the city. It did not. Not that panic alone changes policy. It may not. But it shattered a line in the mind. The line between the front and the center. The line between danger and distance. The line between war as spectacle and war as lived experience. Once that line breaks, leaders cannot fully restore it with speeches. They can manage damage. They can tighten security. They can improve defenses. They can punish leaks and control the narrative. But they cannot make people forget the sound of the night when the capital stopped feeling untouchable. And in a war built so heavily on image, that memory is a weapon too. So if you are watching what comes next, do not only watch the front maps. Watch the refineries. Watch the airports. Watch the emergency notices. Watch the rhythm of the nights around Moscow. Because that is where part of this war is moving now. Not just in trenches and ruined towns, but in the systems that keep